The desert had a way of swallowing things. Sound, distance, doubt, all vanished into the wide yellow jaws of it, ground into silence by the endless heat-buckled horizon. I stepped out of the transport van, boots striking the cracked tarmac of the surface lot, and the air clamped down against my skin. Thin, sharp-edged, carrying the sour chemical tang of ozone and sun-blasted metal. Above me, the fake telemetry towers stretched like the bones of dead things, pointing at empty patches of sky where no satellites moved. Telemetry Station 47B. That was the official name stamped onto the side of the prefab administration shack. A dead-end NASA posting for engineers who had either misbehaved or grown inconvenient. Publicly. Privately, beneath 5 levels of black-budget misdirection, it was something else entirely. The Orion Signals Division, a place where whispers were caught out of the cosmos, torn apart and locked away before they could infect the thinking parts of the world. A place where men like me, disgraced, disbelieved, discarded, were quietly pulled from the wreckage of their careers and asked to drown in service one last time. The security gates stuttered open on stiff mechanical joints, and a guard in black utilities, anonymous behind a full visor, waved me through with a short, practiced gesture. No words, no welcoming committee. The sun hammered against the back of my neck as I crossed the yard toward the admin building, feeling every old scar in my hands tighten under the heat. There was a rhythm to it, unintentional but undeniable. The tap of my boots on concrete, the dry rattle of sand against metal, the hollow drone of the high desert wind pressing against false structures. And underneath it all, something else. A second rhythm, softer. A liquid murmur just at the edge of hearing where no ocean should be. I paused mid-stride, head tilted slightly. Nothing but the wind. Inside the admin shack, the temperature dropped by 20 degrees, but the air smelled no cleaner. It carried the flat, almost metallic taste of artificial coolants and machine-cycled oxygen, a filtered sterility that made you feel less alive just by breathing it. The walls were painted a bureaucratic shade of beige, chipped and bubbling in places, as if the building itself was trying to shrug off its false skin. A young technician waited just inside, shifting nervously from foot to foot. She wore the Orion Signals patch, a black circle cleaved by a jagged silver line, on the shoulder of her coveralls. "Dr. Avery?" she asked, voice tight with unspent energy. I nodded. That is correct. She glanced once toward the interior doors, heavy things, reinforced and sealed with redundant mechanical locks. Then back at me. "They're expecting you. This way, please." No handshake, no smile, just the brisk, clipped efficiency of someone ferrying an unstable package. I followed her down a narrow corridor that sloped gently downward, imperceptible to most, but not to someone who had spent half a life measuring pressure gradients and the shape of spaces. Every 20 feet, a manual override crank jutted from the wall near an emergency seal. Old-world designs. Analog redundancy in case the digital systems got compromised or infected. The walls were studded with small sensor ports and heat dispersal vents, all polished to a dull sheen. At level -1, she left me at a thick security door flanked by 2 armed personnel, both wearing the heavier variant of Orion's environmental hazard gear. Thick, fiber suits, reflective faceplates, portable signal inhibitors buzzing at their belts. They scanned my credentials, nodded once and keyed the door open. Chief Peter Langford waited inside. In person, he looked even harder than his reputation. Broad-shouldered, buzz-cut, posture so rigid it seemed carved from the same rock as the desert outside. His black fatigues were spotless, his sidearm visible but not ostentatious. Behind him, banks of monitoring equipment blinked in silent patterns, displaying dense streams of code, waveform graphs and deep-sea bioluminescent spectrums. Langford did not offer a seat. He studied me for a long moment, assessing, weighing, deciding whether I was a resource or a liability, or both. "Dr. Daniel Avery," he said finally, voice like gravel sifted through wire mesh. Formerly of NOAA, then UW Marine Sciences, specialist in extremophile biomes and unconventional theories of oceanic cognitive systems. There it was. Not an accusation, not a compliment, just a statement of fact. A scar laid bare, not healed by time, only thickened. I had spent half my life trying to prove that oceans, given enough time and the right pressures, could evolve minds of their own. Vast, distributed intelligences seeded in the deep, where light never touched. For that belief, I had been mocked, blacklisted, quietly erased from the academic world I once thought I belonged to. And now here I was, summoned by men who had laughed at me, to speak to something their instruments could no longer deny. I inclined my head slightly. "You have read my obituary." His mouth twitched, not a smile, more a minor calibration. "We pulled you in because we have a problem," he said, stepping aside so I could see the primary monitor. At first glance, it looked like a standard atmospheric readout. Spectral absorption lines mapping gas compositions, methane, carbon dioxide, trace elements. K218b, the Hycean world, 120 light-years away. The place where, against every cautious public announcement, we had found signatures not just compatible with life, but suspiciously similar to Earth's own marine ecosystems. But layered across the data, ghosting through the chemical readings, was something else. A pattern, rhythmic, recursive, alive. Langford spoke with the bluntness of a man who considered information dangerous if left to ferment. We detected anomalous structures embedded in the atmospheric data, patterns too organized for natural variance, initially dismissed as processing artifacts. Then technicians started hearing rhythmic artifacts through monitoring channels, clicks, murmurs, dreams. Dreams. My throat tightened slightly, unbidden. Langford continued. The working theory is that the oceans of K218b are not merely biological reservoirs. They are signaling, perhaps intentionally, perhaps not. I stared at the monitor, the breath in my chest turning cold. It was not random. I could feel the rhythm looping inside my skull, subtle, tidal, like a heart beating out of time. "And you want me to determine if it's conscious?" I asked. Langford shook his head once. "No. We want you to determine if it's a threat, and if it is, help us decide how to cut the line before it cuts back." Behind him, another door opened, revealing a secondary corridor leading deeper underground. Dimmer lighting, thicker walls, the real work buried far from the world above. "Dr. Greavves is waiting for you in analysis 2, Langford said. "You'll be working with him to decrypt the deeper layers of the signal. No unauthorized transmissions, no solo access, full psych monitoring protocols in effect." "And if the signal adapts?" I asked quietly. Langford's eyes, a hard, flat grey, locked onto mine. "Then you'll see why Orion signals exists." The heavy door at the end of the corridor buzzed, unlocking with a deep mechanical clunk. The technician glanced back at me once, pale and hollow-eyed, before disappearing into the admin block. I crossed the threshold alone. For a moment, just before the door sealed behind me, I caught the scent of salt water. I hesitated there, my hand against the seam of the door. Some part of me recoiled, not in fear, but in recognition. I had spent my life chasing the ocean's voice, believing it could speak if only I listened hard enough. Now, standing at the threshold, I realized I had never asked if the ocean would want to speak back. Not real. Not possible here, hundreds of miles from the nearest coast. Still, it filled my nostrils with the memory of spray and cold, wet stone, dragging me back to the shoreline of my childhood, to the day Nathan, my brother, was taken. A rogue wave, the kind old fishermen warned about and no one believed until it rose from a flat sea, cold and sudden as betrayal. I had been standing just 10 feet away, shouting for him to run. He had turned once, smiling that reckless smile of his, and then the water swallowed him, and the tide receded, and he was simply not there anymore. Even after all these years, the smell of salt could bring him back, ghosting in the corners of my mind like a half-heard tide pulling at a shoreline that no longer existed. The deeper levels of the facility were colder, but not comfortably so. A damp, rising cold that clung to the skin, hinted at breached insulation, or worse. The scent changed too. Not just metal and chemical filters anymore, but something older. A mineral tang that tickled the back of my throat, like the memory of seawater left too long in the sun. I found the door marked Analysis 2 and pressed my palm against the sensor. It recognized my new credentials and slid open with a reluctant groan. Inside, the light was low and tight, casting shadows across a cluttered workstation. Mechanical pencils, fractured notebooks, spooling graphs and recursive flowcharts pinned with obsessive neatness. And on the central monitor, the signal. It moved across the screen like a living thing. It folded and unfolded in breath-like rhythms, weaving itself around the raw data streams, embedding itself in patterns designed to be invisible to human cognition. Except now it was not invisible. Now it watched. I stepped closer. Could almost feel the moisture gathering at the corners of my eyes, the taste of salt sharpening at the edges of my tongue. The thought surfaced, unbidden, unwelcome. We are not intercepting a message. We are standing in its tide pool, ankle deep, waiting for the tide to rise. From the corner of the room, a quiet voice broke the spell. "You're late." I turned. Dr. Anton Greavves sat hunched over a secondary console, a stylus twirling absently through his fingers, his eyes moving in quick, sharp cuts across endless reams of data. Wiry, twitchy, somehow already eroded at the edges, like a man trying to build a fire in the rain with wet matches. Without looking up, he added, "They're reaching, Avery. The oceans." His voice lowered to a whisper. "And the worst part is, I think they finally found something to hold on to." Greavves handed me a stylus without ceremony, along with a blank graphing sheet, its surface already damp at the corners from the condensation bleeding through the chilled air. "Map what you see," he said, "not what you think you see." I sat across from him at the cramped workbench, the chair too low, the back too rigid. Deliberate discomfort, I realized. Standard Orion Signals design philosophy. Keep analysts half miserable to ward off complacency. It rarely worked. The signal moved lazily across the primary monitor between us, folding and unfolding in patterns too elegant to be human, too structured to be noise. I pressed the tip of the stylus against the sheet. Lines bled outward, curves nested within curves. Not random, never random. There was a logic here, deeper than chemistry, older than language. Somewhere behind us, a ventilation unit coughed, hacking thin streams of cold vapor into the room like a dying thing. Greavves spoke without looking up. "Most patterns you can pull apart. Find the understructure. Chaos gives way to sense if you apply enough force. And this one," he gave a sharp, shallow laugh, "this one gives way to more pattern, like a coastline you can never finish mapping. The closer you get, the more shoreline you find." He finally glanced at me, eyes bright with exhaustion. "Fractals, but not mathematical ones, biological." My hands moved across the graph paper with a will of their own, sketching tidal spirals, blooming structures, recursive flows. I knew these shapes. I had seen them in the proliferation of extremophile colonies near thermal vents, in the surface patterns of red algal blooms fed fat on pollution. Only here they breathed with something more, something intentional. Greavves turned one of the small dials on the console, modulating the signal feed. A low clicking sound issued from the speakers, dry, arrhythmic, but steadily becoming coherent. A kind of breathing. I thought of the deep sea vents I had studied long ago, how life there thrived not on sunlight but on black exhalations from the Earth's wounds. Perhaps all life was a byproduct of breath, ours, the oceans, even the stars. Perhaps we had mistaken breathing for living, and were only now hearing it from something older. A warning chime sounded from the wall, a soft, triple tone. Psychotronic signal event detected. A protocol embedded deep in Orion's systems. It indicated that the data feed had crossed a threshold known to produce minor cognitive anomalies if left unchecked. I reached forward instinctively to mute it, but Greavves grabbed my wrist, surprisingly strong. "Not yet," he said. "Listen." The clicking shifted. Subtle phase changes, minor tempo accelerations, not random modulation. It was adapting. "You're hearing it too?" I asked, lowering my voice without thinking. Greavves tapped a knuckle against his temple. "It hears us hearing it." Another warning chime. Greavves reluctantly thumbed the signal dampener and the clicks fell away into static. For a moment, I sat there, breathing carefully through my nose, as if the air itself might betray me. My fingertips tingled with phantom sensation as though touched by something unseen. When I glanced down, my hand had traced a new shape on the graph paper without conscious intent. A spiral drawn tighter and tighter into itself, until the center bled into nothing. Hours passed unnoticed. Greavves and I worked like divers descending into deeper pressure zones, exchanging clipped technical phrases, then lapsing into long silences. Every few minutes, one of us would check the neural baseline monitors, small, wrist-mounted readers that tracked stress indicators and language coherence. At Orion signals, these were not medical tools. They were early warning systems. A minor dip in linguistic stability could mean the difference between controlled analysis and permanent cognitive drift. By the fourth hour, the room seemed subtly misshapen. Walls flexed in my peripheral vision, swelling and contracting with the same slow rhythm as the breathing signal. It was a trick of exhaustion. I told myself that. It had to be. I excused myself briefly under the pretense of retrieving additional reference material. Truthfully, I needed distance, needed to feel the texture of the walls under my palm, the anchor of friction and cold against my skin. The corridor outside was narrower than I remembered. The overhead fluorescence hummed low and sullen, the light a yellow bruise against the metal panels. Down the hall, senior technician Wallace Garin was crouched by an access junction, tapping the wall with a small rubber mallet. Garin was a fixture in facilities like this, an old maintenance chief kept on not because he was polished, but because he could smell stress fractures before scanners detected them. His weathered face was carved with deep-set lines, and he muttered to himself as he worked, pausing after every tap to listen intently. He noticed me after a moment, offering a grunt of acknowledgement. "Evening, Doc," he said, voice hoarse from years of inhaling dust and solvents. "Place is sweating." I approached cautiously. "Sweating?" He tapped a spot on the seam where two wall panels met. When he pulled his hand away, I saw a faint glisten. Moisture. Impossible given the internal desiccation systems and layered humidity scrubbing protocols built into every inch of the Orion sublevels. Garin wiped his hand on his coveralls in a rough, practiced motion, as if he had wiped away worse things before. "Fix the leak. Hope the leak ain't in your brain," he muttered. Then he turned back to his inspection, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. I left him there, hammering rhythms into the bones of a dying building. When I returned to analysis 2, Greavves was leaning heavily over the console, hands planted on either side like a man steadying himself against a sudden wave. The monitors hissed low static, the signal briefly suppressed. He straightened as I entered, and I saw a shimmer at the edges of his eyes, like a mirror catching a reflection it was not meant to hold. "You're hearing it now?" I asked. He nodded slowly, and dreaming. He tapped a page of notes, ordinary at first glance, filled with signal decryption sequences and recursive pattern models. But interspersed between the numbers and graphs, in a hand I barely recognized as Greavves, were strange fluid shapes, not doodles but attempts, as if something inside him was trying to redraw the world from the inside out. They resembled currents, or vascular systems, or maps of coastlines that no cartographer had ever drawn. "We need to log this," I said carefully. "Psychotronic contamination protocols." Greavves gave a tight, bitter smile. "Sure. Fill out the forms. File the paperwork. While the ocean fills the air ducts and rewrites our maps." I hesitated. The procedural instincts drilled into me, warring with the colder reality settling in my gut. He was right. By the time the alarms went up formally, it would already be too late. The facility wasn't just listening anymore. It was resonating, carrying the pattern through every thin seam, every damp wire, every breath in every lung. As if summoned by the thought, a low rumble sounded from deeper in the complex. Structural ventilation realigning under pressure, or something moving that was not supposed to move. The comms console crackled once. A voice, or the ghost of one, whispered a single word. "Welcome." Greavves flinched. I turned to the monitor instinctively. No transmission code logged. No incoming signal officially detected. The console was blind. The facility's systems were blind. But the oceans were not. We initiated a partial lockdown of the analysis wing. Standard Level 2 isolation measures, limited ingress, decontamination stations active, psychotronic filters installed in the ventilation system. It was, I knew even as I punched in the override codes, a futile gesture, like putting sandbags around a beach while the tide swelled just beyond sight. As we worked, I caught my own reflection briefly in a pane of darkened glass. My face, gaunt, salt-scoured, already unfamiliar. For a brief second, I thought I saw Nathan, my brother's features overlaid onto mine by some cruel trick of light and grief. I looked away quickly. Later, in my assigned quarters, I sat in the dimness, hands folded around a ceramic mug of black too-hot coffee. The walls sweated quietly. The floor vibrated in minute, steady pulses. I tried to record a field note. Voice activation failed. Manual recording only. A precaution against pattern contamination. Another of Orion's endless layers of half-measures. I spoke aloud into the recorder, my voice sounding thin and brittle in the vastness of the small room. Initial subject analysis suggests the K218b atmospheric anomalies are not stochastic. Embedded signal structures exhibit recursive growth, adaptive mimicry, and evidence of cognitive resonance. I paused. The recorder clicked, waiting. The air tasted faintly of brine. I whispered the rest. "We are not observing from a distance. We are already inside its reach." The dreams began to spread 2 days after the first resonance. At first they came quietly, like the lapping of unseen waves against the edges of consciousness. Technicians muttered about sleep inertia and comm-lag drift, convincing themselves it was nothing more than the body rebelling against too many hours under fluorescent skies and metal floors. But I knew better. You can always tell the difference between a dream your mind invents and a dream you have been given. Mine began in a bay I did not recognize, beneath a starless black ceiling. The water stretched out in every direction, motionless, gleaming with the soft sheen of oil. And beneath that false calm, something vast and breathing shifted in the depths, waiting. Each time I woke, the taste of salt burned against the back of my throat, as if I had swallowed a mouthful of it in my sleep. Greavves was worse. He barely slept at all now, hunched over his notebooks like a priest keeping vigil at the altar of a dying god. His diagrams had begun to fracture, neat recursive spirals breaking into jagged fungal veins that spread across the margins, threading outward as if seeking the edges of the page to escape. We both knew what it meant, though neither of us spoke it aloud yet. Cognitive seepage, a phenomenon Orion signals documented clinically, but never truly understood. The process by which alien signal structures, not content but form itself, invaded the mind's architecture, rewriting thought before awareness could resist. Containment orders tightened. Access to the lower levels was restricted to personnel with Level 6 site clearance and mandatory neural scan compliance. New signage appeared overnight. Heavy metal placards riveted directly to the walls. Cognitive hazard zones, subject to immediate isolation. Security patrols increased to protect what remained of the facility's structural sanity. Every shift change now included a resonance affirmation, a grim ritual where teams would repeat a series of benign phrases designed to flag early linguistic degradation. I stood through one of them outside Analysis 2, shoulder to shoulder with Greavves and two silent comms technicians. The lead security officer, a grizzled veteran with a facial tic that had grown more pronounced over the past 48 hours, read aloud the affirmation script. I am human. I know the boundaries of my mind. I recognize and reject non-native thought structures. The words felt hollow in my mouth. They did not banish the wrongness. They only made it more visible. The breach came not through malice, but through fear. 3 junior analysts, Carter, Venn, and Kim, had been working the late shift in Containment Processing Room B, a small annex attached to the main decryption labs. Their task was simple: monitor low-threat signal loops, catalog minor pattern variations, report anomalies. But that night, the signal changed, reached out in a way it never had before. A long, slow magnetic pull woven through the static, promising comprehension just barely out of reach. They panicked. Instead of isolating the feed and initiating standard quarantine protocols, they attempted an unsanctioned response, a simple return ping, encoded with Earth's own marine spectral signature. A linguistic mirror, they must have thought. A safe way to acknowledge without inviting. They were wrong. The moment the transmission fired, the facility shook. Not in a way machines could register, no seismic alarms, no critical failures, but something deeper, something structural to the very air. The walls seemed to flex inward, as if taking a slow, deliberate breath. The lights overhead dimmed, not because of a power fluctuation, but because some intangible layer between us and the real world had thickened, occluding the clarity of simple vision. Greavves and I rushed to containment processing, emergency override badges flashing against the half-frozen access systems. Inside, we found the junior analysts huddled near their terminal, faces pale, eyes dilated unnaturally wide. The screen showed no signal traces now, only a blank field of grey static, scrolling endlessly. And the floor, God help us, the floor was wet. A fine, uniform sheen of moisture, like the room had been exhaled upon by something vast and cold. Langford arrived moments later, flanked by 2 security officers in full cognitive hazard gear, heavy black suits with narrow filtered visors and analog breathing apparatus. Without speaking, he motioned for the officers to extract the analysts, who shambled away as if moving underwater. Langford turned to me. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice lower than usual, weighted with something heavier than anger. I forced the words out through a throat that felt partially submerged. "They responded," I said. "They sent a return signal. Marine echo patterns." For a long moment, Langford did not move. Then he keyed his wrist scanner, a secure channel activation, and spoke 3 clipped words. "Initiate Tier 3 sequestration." Tier 3 sequestration was not just a lockdown. It was a protocol acknowledging that standard containment had already failed, and that the focus must shift from prevention to sacrificial isolation. It was the point where survival became an exercise in buying time for the next generation, not saving the current one, a triage of existence itself. Entire facility sectors could be sealed off, sterilized or destroyed without warning. The black bands of the internal alert system stuttered to life, a low, bone-deep vibration, as if the Earth itself disapproved of what we had done. From that moment forward, the Orion Signals Division was no longer a research station. It was a wound, self-infected, cauterizing itself 1 inch at a time to prevent the rot from reaching the bloodstream of the world above. I returned to my quarters, finding the door ajar despite the auto-seal protocols. Inside, everything was subtly off. Not disheveled, there were no signs of intrusion, no broken objects, but a sense of misplacement, as if invisible hands had sifted through my belongings while I was away. My cot had moved a degree to the left. My datapad sat on the wrong side of the desk, and on the floor near the drainage vent, a small puddle of water gleamed dully in the dim overhead light. I approached it, heart hammering a warning cadence behind my ribs. The puddle was no larger than a child's footprint, but as I leaned closer, I could see patterns shifting in its reflection, ripples forming words I could not fully comprehend, fragments of thought too alien to lock into human syntax. I backed away, mouth dry, every fibre of my body screaming a warning my conscious mind could not yet articulate. I did not sleep. Not because of fear, because of the sound. A slow, steady, sibilant breathing that threaded through the air vents, never rising, never falling, as if something monstrous and endless was curled just outside the range of vision, waiting for the moment I forgot it existed. And through it all, the same whispered word, looping beneath the edges of consciousness. Welcome. By morning, the changes had accelerated. Technicians stumbled through corridors, their movements sluggish, eyes unfocused. Surface-level hallucinations were reported by at least 6 personnel. Phantom ocean currents glimpsed through the walls, distant whale song vibrating through the steel supports. Containment specialist Saul Richter, Orion's lead field medic, quietly began marking personnel with unspoken gestures. A tap on the left shoulder for those deemed at risk, a tap on the right for those already lost. No one spoke of it openly. To name contamination was to invite it faster. The ocean was no longer reaching through the data streams alone. It was threading itself into the physical medium of our existence. The walls, the water, the language, the minds. We had answered, and it had heard us. The walls were breathing, not metaphorically, not in the sense of imagination sparked by exhaustion, but in the way a living membrane flexes with the movement of unseen lungs. Standing in the observation corridor outside Cognitive Hazard Lab 3, I watched the metal seams bow inward with each soft, wet exhale, and still I told myself to take another step. Inside the lab, Dr. Abram Saul and Chief Langford were already waiting. Both men wore the black operational suits of last resort containment, heavy fiber armor designed to dampen visual and auditory contamination. Their visors were opaque, reflective, the surface of each catching and distorting the overhead light until neither face seemed entirely real. I was wearing nothing but my standard Orion uniform, sweat soaking through the back of my collar. There was no point in armor now. Not when the breach was no longer theoretical. Not when it lived in the walls, in the water, in the slow, degrading cadence of our own thoughts. Langford's voice came through the comm unit clipped to my shoulder, modulated and flattened by signal-scrubbing algorithms designed to prevent mimetic infection. Analysis 2 is gone. Containment processing is gone. Tier 3 measures have slowed the spread, but not stopped it. He paused, letting the silence press down hard, forcing the weight of it into my bones before continuing. Earth's oceans are reacting. Spectral readings confirm bloom activity in all major basins. Oxygenation patterns shifting. Coastal algal concentrations increasing by a factor of 2 every 24 hours. He turned towards me, the black surface of his helmet swallowing all reflections. You said this was not a call. You said it was a preparation. I nodded slowly, throat too dry for words at first. It is not reaching out to find us, I said. It is grooming us. The alien ocean was not simply communicating. It was altering the environmental conditions of Earth's own biosphere, weaving its resonance into the water that had always defined life here. And through the echo of that manipulation, the minds of those who listened, those who breathed the wrong air, touched the wrong surfaces, dreamed the wrong dreams, were being quietly rewritten. I had spent half my life trying to prove that oceans could evolve intelligence. Now I understood the truth. Intelligence was not the apex of life. It was only a tool for larger organisms, vast, distributed minds, to reach beyond themselves. K218b's oceans were not curious. They were colonial. Dr. Sol stepped forward, his movements slower than usual, as if carrying an unseen burden strapped across his back. "The breach will not stop here," he said. "The signal is self-replicating through conceptual resonance. Even physical destruction will only delay dissemination, unless we introduce a hostile termination vector." "A counter-signal," I said. Saul inclined his head slightly, a gesture more ritualistic than affirmative. "A mimetic toxin, injected into the recursive structure at the point of highest resonance, forced the alien ocean to perceive Earth as unsuitable, broken, contaminated beyond absorption. It was an insane plan, and it was the only plan." Langford crossed his arms, the bulk of his suit creaking softly. "We can build a viral pattern," he said. "Data seeded with entropy, loss, madness. But it must be carried by a human mind, a mind fully exposed, fully contaminated, capable of transmitting the idea at the deepest level." I knew, even before he said it, where this was going. Some part of me, still clinging to the thin bones of scientific rationality, wanted to protest, to argue that no single mind could bear such a weight without crumbling into meaninglessness. But deeper still, another part, the part that had watched a wave steal Nathan without mercy, knew this was how tides worked. They pulled without concern for what clung to the shore. We found Greavves in what had once been the analysis wing, now little more than a hollowed shell, walls sweating brine, the air thick with the smell of metal and rotting algae. He sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by pages of his notes, the diagrams having evolved beyond geometry into something disturbingly organic. Root systems, capillaries, the branching folds of a brain seen through deep-water murk. When we approached, he looked up with eyes that did not quite track properly, his gaze slipping sideways before latching onto us. "You hear it too now," he said almost reverently. I crouched down in front of him, careful not to touch the pages, which seemed to shudder slightly at the disturbance of air. "Anton," I said, keeping my voice steady, "we need your help." He smiled then, a thin, cracked thing, and for a moment I saw the man he had been before the tide turned inside his skull. "You want me to speak to it?" he said. "Not speak," I said. "Poison." He considered that for a moment, head tilting to one side, the way a bird might regard a dying thing. "And what happens to the poison?" There was no lie clean enough to soften the answer. "You will not come back." For a long time he said nothing. Then he reached out, fingers trembling, and pressed his palm against my chest, just over my heart. "Better me than the oceans," he whispered. The preparation was brutal. Greavves was fitted with a cortical amplifier, a heavy crown of neural induction coils designed to magnify thought signatures into coherent broadcast patterns. The device was originally built for experimental psychotronic communication systems, a project mothballed after early tests produced irreversible neural collapse in volunteers. Now it would serve its final purpose. I stood in the broadcast chamber with him as the technicians, those few still coherent enough to function, completed the connections. Thick fiber-optic lines snaked from the amplifier into the central transmission core. The floor beneath us vibrated in slow, arrhythmic beats, the facility itself caught in the final spasms of its dying systems. Greavves turned to me once, just before the helmet lowered over his face. "I'll see him," he said. It took me longer than it should have to understand. The ocean was not the only grave we shared. Nathan, my brother, lost to the ocean's grasp so long ago, and now perhaps waiting in whatever broken dreamscape Greavves would breach. I pressed my hand against his shoulder, solid, warm, human, one last time. "Tell him," I said, voice shaking. "Tell him I'm sorry." Greavves nodded once. Then the helmet sealed, and he was no longer ours to speak to. The counter-signal ignition was not a sound. It was a sensation, a tearing, a splintering of the thin membrane that separated mind from world. I felt it ripple through my bones, a shuddering wrongness that bent light and gravity in brief spasms. The signal broadcast outwards not in electromagnetic waves, but in concepts: fear, loss, entropy, collapse, seeded into the resonant frequencies that the alien ocean had latched onto. A psychic scream, encoded in decay, hurled across the empty light years to the mind waiting in the hydrogen-drowned depths of K218b. Greavves convulsed once, then again. And then he stilled, the life unwinding from him in slow, delicate spirals. The room around us groaned. Rivulets of salt water poured from the seams in the walls, running in swirling patterns that almost formed words before dissolving into meaningless froth. Langford's voice crackled over the emergency comm line. "Collapse initiated. Evacuate to surface." We ran, those of us still capable of running. Through halls that bent and twisted under unseen pressures, through doors that buckled and wept salt, past containment bays where forgotten things thrashed against reinforced glass. The Orion Signals Division, once the last firewall between Earth and the unthinking vastness beyond, died behind us, sinking into itself like a drowned corpse. When we reached the surface, the desert was cool and grey under a bruised sky. The telemetry towers stood silent and crooked, pointing now not to the heavens, but to some unseen, forgotten place beneath the earth. Behind us the ground trembled once, a deep, subsonic convulsion, and then fell still. The facility was gone, buried, sealed in its own salted grave. I stood there, boots grinding into dry sand, and tilted my head back to stare up at the star-scattered sky. For a moment, just a heartbeat, just the twitch of an old nerve, the stars above seemed to blink, all at once, as if something colossal and unseen had turned its attention away. We had not defeated it. We had not conquered or banished or overcome. We had simply convinced it, for now, to look elsewhere. And I knew, in the hollow ache left behind where hope should have been, that it was only a matter of time before it looked again. The world did not end. It simply shifted a few invisible degrees off its old axis, until what remained no longer fit cleanly into human eyes or minds. Weeks after the collapse of Orion's Signals Division, I sat alone on the crumbling back porch of a government-provided safe house, staring out over a slice of Washington coastline that had once felt like home. The air was colder here than I remembered. The tide lines lay strangely farther inland, the wet sand below the cliffside tinged with an iridescent sheen, the kind you see when oil slicks spread over forgotten harbours, beautiful and poisonous at once, that did not catch the light the way water should. The ocean whispered below me, endless and indifferent. It no longer sounded like the seas of my youth. There was a cadence in the waves now, a slow, recursive break and draw, like the steady, sleep-heavy breathing of something too large to wake fully, but never truly asleep. A sharp salt wind scraped across the porch, rattling the old planks beneath my boots, and I pulled the worn naval-issue jacket tighter around my shoulders. It was late evening, though the grey sky filtered the light so completely that no sharp lines remained to separate land, sea, and air. Only gradients of dissolving ash colour, as if the world itself were slowly being erased from the edges inward. Inside the safe house, a television flickered silently against the wall, tuned to a muted news channel. Stock footage of rising coastal bloom events played on an endless loop. Unseasonal algal blooms choking the eastern seaboard, discolouring the Gulf waters, washing strange white foam onto Pacific beaches. The official narrative, dictated from a room buried deeper even than Orion had been, was climate acceleration. Unfortunate, but explainable. Misinformation campaigns had been seeded online, carefully blending truth and fabrication. Microplastic contamination, temperature shifts, long-neglected chemical runoff. There would be no mention of the dead facility, no breath of the signal, no trace of the sacrifice made to stave off something older and wider than the collective memory of mankind. The public would forget. It was what they were best at. A soft knock at the door drew me out of my reverie. I rose stiffly and opened it to find a man I did not recognize. Mid-40s, clean-cut, dressed in a civilian contractor's field jacket that bulged slightly at the seams where concealed gear sat heavy underneath. No visible badge, no ID shown. He did not offer a name. He did not need to. The agency had sent a minder, someone to ensure that I remained both alive and silent, though not necessarily in that order of priority. He handed me a slim manila folder, thick with classified markers, before stepping back onto the gravel drive without waiting for acknowledgement. Inside the folder were briefings, heavily redacted, biological samples from newly mutated phytoplankton colonies, psychometric drift reports from coastal populations, spectral analysis confirming continued anomalous oxygenation spikes in deep water regions. The last page bore a simple statement: public disclosure, negative, event causality, unprovable, operational status, monitored only. I let the folder fall shut against my lap, the pages fluttering briefly like a dying bird's wings, and stared back out at the ocean. In the weeks following Orion's collapse, I underwent a battery of post-contact cognitive assessments, a sterile euphemism for the slow, clinical stripping of a man's mind down to its ribs to see what had changed. I passed them all. Not because I was unchanged, because whatever damage had been done was too subtle, too foundational, to be captured by machines still calibrated to human baselines. Sometimes I caught myself reaching for words that did not exist. Sometimes I dreamed of endless beaches under black skies, where the tides were made not of water, but of memory itself, washing and eroding all that stood. I no longer feared the ocean. Fear had been washed out of me, not by courage, but by the simple recognition of scale. We were never the stewards of this world. We were only ever tenants, tolerated briefly by older, quieter forces waiting beneath the surface. Greavves had bought us time, a few decades, perhaps a century, by poisoning the contact, convincing the alien mind that Earth was unsuitable. But damage once seeded does not heal. It grows roots, the blooms in the water, the shifts in chemistry, the small but persistent alterations in marine life behavior. They were not accidents. They were adaptations. The Earth was no longer entirely ours. It never had been. We had simply been permitted to forget that we lived inside a larger organism's skin. At night, I sat on the porch long after the last of the light had drained away, listening. Sometimes, when the wind fell still and the only sound was the slow rasp of the sea drawing breath, I thought I could almost hear it. The rhythmic clicking patterns Greavves and I had first decrypted in that sealed chamber, miles beneath New Mexico sand. A presence. Just the fact of something vast and dreaming. Its thoughts slower and wider than human time could measure. It no longer needed to speak. It had already touched us. The wound was made. The healing would never come. In the end, there would be no final revelation, no grand confrontation, no burning light in the sky. Only this. The slow, tidal erosion of humanity's dominion, carried outward through the veins of the oceans, reshaping life a fraction of a percent at a time, until the species that named itself Homo sapiens found itself strangers in a world it no longer understood. We would not go out with a scream. We would vanish like a footprint beneath a rising tide, and somewhere far across the void, in the cold hydrogen seas of K218b, an ancient mind would turn its attention elsewhere, having found no suitable harbor here. I rose stiffly from the chair, joints aching from the long stillness, and walked to the edge of the cliff. Below me, the ocean stretched out endless and gleaming under the dead grey sky. The waves broke against the shore in recursive, measured patterns, breathing, always breathing. I closed my eyes and let the salt wind burn across my face, tasting memory, tasting loss. Somewhere beneath the surface, something shifted, slow and patient and inevitable. I whispered the only prayer I had left, my voice stolen by the wind as soon as it left my mouth. Sleep a little longer. I turned from the cliff and the breathing water beyond, not because I believed the danger had passed, but because I understood now. Tides were not meant to be defeated. They were meant to be endured, if you could endure the knowing.